In the year 1487, something happened in Tenochtitlan that no other civilization had ever attempted on this scale. For 4 straight days, lines of captives stretched from the base of the great temple, across the causeways of the city, and out toward the surrounding towns on the lake. The lines never stopped, not for a single moment, not for 4 entire days. The number recorded by the Aztecs themselves? 84,000. 84,000 people in just 4 days. Historians still argue about that figure. Some say it was exaggerated, others suggest closer to 20,000, and some believe the real number may have been even higher. But there's one thing no one disputes: why those people were there, and what happened to every single one of them. You think you know this story, right? Maybe you've seen something like it in Apocalypto: the chase, the capture, the stone altar, the blade, the body tumbling down the steps. That's the version made for a 2-hour film. The real version? It lasted months, sometimes an entire year. Because the Aztecs didn't just kill their captives. That would have been simple, quick. And nothing about this system was designed to be quick. Some prisoners were fed the finest food in the empire. They were dressed in gold, taught to play instruments, given companions, given new names, names that weren't their own. They were worshipped. People in the streets would bow to them, touch their skin, pray to them as if they were living gods. And then, on a specific day, calculated months in advance by priests who studied the stars, every piece of that identity was stripped away. The gold, the name, the god they had been turned into, all of it gone. And what remained was no longer a god, just a man, standing at the base of a temple, with nowhere left to go but up. A dead enemy couldn't be brought back to Tenochtitlan. He couldn't be painted, presented at the temple, or used to feed what needed to be fed. That's why the macuahuitl, the wooden weapon lined with obsidian blades, wasn't used to kill on the battlefield. It was used to wound, to break a leg, slice open a shoulder, just enough to bring a man down without finishing him. Then he was dragged off the field, bound, and the journey back to the capital began. That journey could take days, sometimes weeks. The captive was guarded, but not starved, not beaten, because whatever awaited him in Tenochtitlan required him to arrive intact. And the first thing he saw when he entered the city, the temple, visible from every direction, across the causeways from the lake, from every street leading into the ceremonial centre, 45 metres high, dark stairways stained with old blood. He knew what happened at the top. Everyone did. What he didn't know yet was whether he would end up there or somewhere else entirely, because not all captives were the same, and the Aztecs had a system to decide exactly where each one would go. The first factor? The warrior who captured him, his rank, his achievements, his position within the military order. That determined the captive's initial value. The second factor? The captive himself, his size, his posture, his physical condition, whether he fought well or fell quickly, whether he showed fear on the march or composure. Everything was observed, recorded, evaluated, because different rituals required different kinds of people. Some ceremonies needed large numbers, dozens, even hundreds. Those captives were processed quickly. Their fate came within days. Sometimes, within hours of arriving, they were climbing the steps of the Templo Mayor. And what happened at the top followed a pattern everyone already knows. The obsidian blade. The chest opened. The heart removed, still beating. The body rolling down the steps. And the next captive stepping forward. That was the version that happened at scale. The one that produced numbers like those 4 days in 1487. But it wasn't the only version, because some captives were set aside, not for mass ceremonies, but for something that took far longer. These men were chosen according to criteria controlled by the priests. Physical appearance mattered. Symmetry mattered. The condition of the skin, age, and something else the sources mention again and again, without ever fully defining it, a certain composure. A particular way a captive carried himself that made him suitable for a different role. These men were not sent straight to the temple stairs. They were taken to the Kalmakak, the priestly schools, and what happened there had no real equivalent anywhere else in the ancient world. The selected captive was cleansed, his war paint was removed, he was washed, his hair was trimmed and arranged, his body was purified with preparations associated with the priesthood. Then he was dressed, not as a prisoner, not in rags, but in the ceremonial attire of a god. Each major deity in the Aztec pantheon had a precise visual identity. Tezcatlipoca wore obsidian mirrors and a distinctive pattern on the face. Totec was associated with flayed skin garments. Huitzilopochtli was marked by hummingbird feathers and a specific shade of blue. The chosen captive was transformed to resemble exactly the deity assigned to him. He became what the Aztecs called an Ixiptla, not a representative, not an actor, not a man pretending to be divine. Within the Aztec theological framework, the Ixiptla was the god, not symbolically, literally. The moment those garments touched his body, his identity changed. His old name was replaced by the name of the deity. Those who spoke to him used divine titles. When he walked through the streets, people did not treat him like a disguised prisoner. They treated him like a god. They knelt before him, brought offerings, asked for blessings, lifted their children toward him. And this continued for months. The best documented version of this process involved the Ixiptla of Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, one of the most important gods in the Aztec world. This captive lived as Tezcatlipoca for nearly a full year. During that time, he was taught to play the flute, and not badly. He was trained to play it well. He was given 4 female companions, also selected for the ritual, presented as divine figures who remained with him during the final weeks. He walked freely through the city. He ate the same food as the nobility. He received flowers, incense, and gold ornaments to wear in public. From the outside, it looked like the most privileged life any captive could possibly receive. But underneath all of it, something else was happening. The priests watched him constantly. Not because they were afraid he would escape. There was nowhere to go. Tenochtitlan was an island city connected by causeways, and every causeway was controlled. They watched him for another reason: his behavior, his mood, his willingness, whether the transformation was taking hold. Because the entire ritual depended on one specific outcome, one that could not be forced at the last moment. When the day came, the captive was expected to walk toward his death voluntarily, not dragged, not tied, not shoved up the steps by guards. He had to climb on his own. As he ascended, he was expected to break the flutes he had played for months, one on each step. He had to reach the summit calmly, and he was expected to lie down on the sacrificial stone of his own accord. This is the point historians have spent decades trying to explain. Some argue it was psychological conditioning, that months of worship reshaped the captive's identity until he truly believed he was the god. And when the day arrived, he no longer saw himself as a prisoner. Others point out that resistance was almost meaningless. Surrounded by thousands, trapped on an island, unarmed, alone, what could fighting possibly change? The ending had already been decided. The only remaining variable was dignity. But there is a third interpretation, and it may be the closest to what the sources actually suggest. The Aztecs seem to have understood something about identity that modern psychology would only formalize centuries later. If you treat a person as something for long enough, inside an environment that never lets up, with constant social reinforcement, that person begins to act like it. Not always because he fully believes it, but because the boundary between acting and being starts to collapse. The captive did not need to believe he was a god. He only needed to stop believing he was still a prisoner. And months of gold, music, comfort, admiration, and ritual attention could do exactly that. But there was one thing the priests could never fully erase. The captive always knew the date. The ceremonial calendar was public. Everyone in Tenochtitlan knew when the festival of Tezcatlipoca was coming, and the captive, living inside that divine identity, knew it too. Every day of luxury came with a countdown attached to it. And in the final weeks, the sources describe something the priests watched very closely. Some captives grew quiet. They stopped playing the flute. They withdrew from their companions. They didn't resist. They didn't try to escape. They simply turned inward. The priests had a phrase for it. Roughly translated, it meant the god becomes heavy. And when that happened, the ritual continued anyway. This is the kind of story most people never hear. If you think stories like this deserve to be told properly, share this video with someone who needs to see it. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because this is just the beginning. Not all captives were turned into gods. Some were given something that from the outside looked like an opportunity. The festival of Tlacaxi-Pehualistli, the flaying of men, was one of the most crowded events in the Aztec ceremonial calendar. It honored Totec, the god associated with agricultural renewal, spring, and the shedding of old skin. At the center of this ritual stood the Temalacatl, a massive circular stone, carved and placed in a public space, where hundreds, sometimes thousands, could watch. The captive was brought to that stone and tied by the waist. The rope was long enough to let him move, short enough to make escape impossible. Then he was given a weapon, a macuahuitl, but not a real one. The obsidian blades, the edges sharp enough to sever limbs, had been removed. In their place, feathers. From a distance it looked convincing. The shape was right, the weight was right, the silhouette was perfect. Someone watching from 20 rows back might not notice, but the man holding it? He knew immediately. That wasn't a weapon, it was a prop. Then the opponents arrived. Eagle warriors, jaguar warriors, the highest-ranking fighters in the Empire, men who had captured dozens of enemies, men whose entire lives had been built around combat. They came armed with real macuahuitl, real obsidian blades, real shields, full war gear, and there were several of them. The captive faced them one at a time, but as one stepped back, another stepped forward, fresh against exhausted, armed against defenseless, free against bound, and the crowd watched everything. This wasn't hidden. It was public theatre. Nobles attended. Allied rulers were invited. Representatives from rival states, states that might one day send their own warriors to that very stone, sat in privileged positions. They watched carefully. They had to. Some captives fell quickly, overwhelmed, defeated within minutes, and the ritual moved on. But others fought. And when they did, the system revealed something else. Because if a captive resisted, if he endured, if he made one of those elite warriors bleed, the crowd didn't react with horror. They approved. A strong captive elevated the ritual. It proved that the Empire's enemies were formidable. And that, in turn, proved that Aztec warriors were even more formidable for having captured them. Resistance didn't weaken the system. It validated it. And then there's the case of Tlahuicole, a Tlaxcalan war captain, captured during one of the so-called Flower Wars. The sources describe him as imposing, tall, broad, experienced in a way that set him apart from ordinary captives. When he was brought to Tenochtitlan, something unusual happened. The emperor, either Moctezuma I or II, depending on the account, offered him freedom. Not exile, not ransom, a choice. Tlahuicole could return to Tlaxcala, or, if he preferred, he could serve as a commander in the Aztec army, lead troops, live in the capital with rank and status. He refused both. He chose the Temalacatl. The sources are clear about that, but not about why. Some later interpretations suggest that returning home as a freed captive, not one who escaped or was rescued, would have been a dishonor worse than death. Others suggest his own warrior code demanded it. Among Tlaxcalan fighters, being captured was already a failure. To return after that failure, carrying the added weight of having accepted mercy from the enemy, might have meant a kind of social death even worse than a physical one. Whatever the reason, Tlahuicole stepped onto the stone by his own will. He was tied, he was given the feathered weapon, and according to the surviving accounts, he didn't fall quickly. He wounded several eagle warriors. Some sources even claim he killed one. though that part is debated. He fought longer than any captive in recent memory. The crowd watched a man fight a battle he had already chosen to lose. And when he finally fell, the ritual continued. Because it always continued. No matter how well a captive fought, the ending had already been decided. What happened next is described in the sources with even less ambiguity. The body was given to the warrior who had captured him. That was his right. The captor took on specific ritual responsibilities that continued even after death, and those responsibilities are recorded clearly in the codices. They are the origin of the festival's name itself, the flaying of men. Every visiting ruler who watched a captive fight with a feathered weapon understood the message without needing translation. This is what your warriors will face if they resist. This is how your strongest men will end. And this is what your people will become. Offerings, dressed in gold, walking willingly toward a stone they cannot escape. That was the purpose of the system. Not just religion, not just military tradition, infrastructure. The flower wars were scheduled, repeated, negotiated diplomatically. The supply of captives was managed. Selection in Tenochtitlan was standardized. Classification into different ritual roles was bureaucratic, not improvised. The Ixiptla process required months of investment, training, and resources. The priesthood operated like a production chain. And the ritual combat on the Tamalacatl, it was staged communication. The system served three functions at once. It fed the religious structure that legitimized Aztec authority. Every ceremony confirmed that the gods supported the empire. Every heart taken atop the temple was proof that the cosmic order continued, because the Aztecs maintained it. Beneath that, it sustained the warrior class. Competitive, hierarchical, dependent on capturing enemies alive. Without captives, there was no advancement, no mobility. Peace wasn't stability, peace was stagnation. And beneath all of that was politics. Public spectacles were watched by the very states the empire needed to control. Trade partners, border communities, potential rebels. They watched, they calculated, and they stayed in line. Not because the Aztecs were unstoppable. Tlaxcala proved they could be resisted, but because the cost of being captured had been demonstrated so clearly, so elaborately, so publicly, that most leaders decided submission was cheaper. These rituals weren't religion that happened to be political. They were politics, using religion. And at the center of everything were the captives. Men who were fed, dressed, trained, worshipped, armed with useless weapons, and sacrificed on a schedule. They were the raw material of a machine that could not function without them. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they found an empire powered by captives. Cortés didn't fully understand what he was seeing. His interpreters tried to explain. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, one of the soldiers who documented the conquest, described the temple complex of Tenochtitlan with a level of detail that suggests genuine shock. Walls darkened by old blood, a constant smell in the air, and the tzompantli, skull racks, holding rows upon rows of human heads. Modern archaeology has confirmed those structures existed at the scale the Spanish described. Thousands of skulls, organized, displayed. But here's what Cortés and his men understood almost immediately. Something the Aztecs' neighbors had known for generations. The system had a dependency. It required enemies who could be captured, but never completely conquered. Tlaxcala, Huexotzinco, Cholula. These states existed in a permanent state of controlled conflict with the Aztec Triple Alliance. They were never fully absorbed, never destroyed, never offered complete integration. Because if they were conquered, the flower wars would end. And if the flower wars ended, the captives would disappear. And if the captives disappeared, the ceremonies would stop. Warriors could not advance. The gods could not be fed. And the political theatre that held the empire together would collapse. The system depended on its enemies remaining enemies. That's what Cortés exploited when he marched on Tenochtitlan. He didn't do it with 500 Spaniards. He did it with tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors, men whose people had spent generations feeding that machine. They didn't join the Spanish because they admired Europe. They joined because they had watched their brothers, their sons, their war captains climb those temple steps, and they wanted it to end. Apocalypto shows a man running for his life. That's the cinematic version. The real system didn't chase. It invited. It dressed its captives in gold and called them gods. It gave them music, food, companionship, worship. It let them walk freely through the most advanced city in the Western Hemisphere. And then, it asked them to climb the steps themselves. The prisoners of the Aztec Empire were not simply killed. They were processed, classified, assigned a role, and made to perform it until the calendar said it was time. The man on the Tamalacatl holding a feathered weapon against warriors with real obsidian blades. He wasn't fighting to survive. He was fulfilling a function, and when he fell, the next man stepped forward, because the system didn't stop. It never stopped. Not until someone realized that its greatest